On a sticky August morning in 1847, something strange happened at the Hartley plantation near Richmond. The usual sounds, field hands talking, horses, the steady rhythm of work, just stopped. People looked up uneasy. Colonel Edmund Hartley had marched his only daughter, Margaret, out to a horse-drawn wagon along with Joseph, the strongest man on the place, famous for hefting whole barrels of tobacco like they weighed nothing. Then they both vanished down that winding path toward the old overseer's cabin, right where the property meets the woods. The forest closes in thick there, and you can't see the main house at all once you're past the wild grapevines and Virginia creeper. For 183 days, nobody saw Margaret or Joseph. Not once. When they finally showed up again, Margaret looked like she'd aged 10 years. Her face was hollow, her belly round with pregnancy. Joseph didn't walk back at all. They brought him home in a pine box. The county doctor wrote cerebral fever on the certificate, but let's be honest, nobody really knew what happened in that cabin. Not for decades. Not until someone found an old tin box under the floorboards of the main house, packed with letters. And those letters? Well, they blew the story wide open. What they revealed about the Hartleys was so desperate, so twisted. Historians are still arguing about it. Before I get into all that, the secrets, the heartbreak, the downfall of one of Virginia's oldest families. Let me ask you something. Where are you listening from? Go ahead. Drop your city or state in the comments. I get a kick out of seeing how far this little community of mystery lovers stretches. And hey, if you're new here, hit subscribe. You really don't want to miss where this story's heading. This isn't the version of the antebellum South you learned in school. The real truth about what happened at Hartley Plantation didn't just fade away with Colonel Hartley. People hid it, layer after layer, until finally, someone dug deep enough to bring it into the light. Richmond in the summer of 1847 felt heavy, like the city was trying to ignore the fact that everything was starting to change. Tobacco made the town rich enough to fill the streets with merchants and lawyers and plantation owners. All that wealth, though, rested on the backs of people the city's elite pretended not to see. Social rules were strict. Reputation could shatter overnight, just from a rumor. Women like Margaret Hartley, well, they got squeezed between impossible expectations and the hard truth of their lives. The Hartley plantation used to cover 400 acres of rolling Virginia Piedmont, but by 1847, only half of it really paid the bills. Years of tobacco farming had worn out the soil, and Colonel Hartley just didn't have what it took to modernize, even though a few neighbors had managed to. The main house still looked grand from a distance, a Georgian brick mansion with white columns, neat gardens, but if you walked up close, you'd see the paint peeling and weeds sneaking into the hedges. Colonel Hartley was 58 that summer, lean, with iron-gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. He'd come back from the Mexican-American War a year and a half earlier, restless, always pacing the grounds at night, cigar in hand, staring out at the fields like he was trying to tally up losses no one else could see. His wife had died of cholera back in '39, so he'd raised Margaret by himself in a world that gave women of her standing exactly two choices: marry well, or spend your life as a poor relation. Margaret, at least in old family albums, had been a lovely child. But by her 20s, she started putting on weight. Her father tried to control her diet, but nothing worked. By 32, the society gossips called her excessively corpulent, and between that and her age, she was out of the marriage market for good. She'd had 3 proposals when she was younger, but her father turned them all down. He thought none of those men measured up. After that, no one else asked. Margaret spent her days reading books her father thought were a waste of time, playing piano better than anyone expected, and walking the plantation grounds when the heat inside got to be too much. The enslaved women who worked in the house said she was kind, but Margaret lived in a kind of isolation that felt endless, like watching the horizon for a distant train that everyone had long forgotten to expect. She was undeniably sharp, her mind quick, agile, restless, but there was little for that intelligence to grasp onto in the heavy air of Hartley Plantation. It was as if she was trapped in a glass jar, her thoughts and feelings swirling with nowhere to escape, forever churning inside her chest until they soured into something corrosive. The grand house, with its echoing halls and closed doors, did nothing to soften this solitude. Instead, it amplified her sense of being cut off, not just from society, which had little use for clever women, but from any possibility of meaningful action. Joseph arrived at the Hartley plantation in the early spring of 1843. When the dogwoods were blooming and the river still ran high from winter rains, the colonel purchased him at the bustling Richmond auction for the considerable sum of $200, a price that set tongues wagging across 3 counties. Men muttered about the wastefulness of such an investment, but the colonel dismissed their doubts. Joseph was 28, a giant of a man, 6'3", with shoulders broad enough to strain the seams of any shirt, and arms corded from years of labor. His presence was enough to make even seasoned overseers glance twice. Before being brought to Hartley, Joseph had belonged to a failing planter in Southside Virginia, a man so deep in debt he'd rented Joseph out to the railroad crews carving tracks through the wilderness. There, Joseph had built more than roadbeds and bridges. He'd built a reputation for endurance and skill, for taking on the hardest shifts and outlasting every other hand. People remembered that too. Colonel Hartley saw only the outward signs of value: strength, reliability, the promise of uncomplaining labor. He imagined Joseph as another cog in the plantation's machinery, a living tool to be used and put away. But Joseph possessed a hidden resource the colonel could not have foreseen. He could read. Someone, long ago and at great risk, had taught him the alphabet and the numbers, a transgression that could have cost a white man $100 fine or worse. Joseph guarded this secret fiercely. He never so much as glanced at a book when others were near. But those who worked closest to him, the house servants, the older women, had noticed his habits. They'd seen him behind the tobacco barn, kneeling in the dust, tracing letters with a broken twig, lips moving silently as if reciting spells. They caught him running his fingers over the stamped words on feed sacks and crates, eyes narrowing in concentration, as though the world's secrets might be hidden in plain sight. For all his size, Joseph moved quietly, speaking only when necessary, his speech measured and correct, so precise it sometimes unsettled those who expected rough dialect and subservience. He never boasted, never groveled, and never invited the overseer's suspicion, which in itself earned him a wary respect from the other enslaved men. Among his peers, Joseph's reputation grew not only for his labor, but for his discretion and quiet intelligence. He never shirked his duties, never drew attention to himself, never let slip anything that might be interpreted as pride or disrespect. Those were the sorts of mistakes that could bring the whip, or worse. To Colonel Hartley, Joseph was little more than a well-trained beast, one who did not complain, and who could be trusted with the most grueling tasks. Margaret, on the other hand, had observed Joseph in a way she would later deny. At the time, she would have said he was just another figure in the background of her life, a presence as unremarkable as the old sycamore by the well or the kitchen cat. In truth, she had noticed him with a kind of detached curiosity, the way one might admire a finely bred horse or a beautifully crafted piece of furniture. Something impressive but not quite real or relevant to her own existence. In 4 years, they had barely exchanged more than a handful of words, brief and formal, usually as she passed by the stables or the equipment shed. When he did speak, his language was flawless, his tone neither servile nor insolent, a neutrality that unsettled her more than open defiance might have. She never entertained the possibility that he harbored dreams, fears, or an inner life as complex as her own. That obliviousness, that refusal to see his full humanity, would one day become her undoing. By the summer of 1847, the world seemed to be closing in on itself. The heat pressed down on the plantation like a smothering hand, turning the air syrupy and thick, making every task in the tobacco fields a trial of endurance. Yet it was not only the weather that made the atmosphere oppressive. Virginia itself seemed on a knife's edge, the newspapers filled with arguments over abolition, the extension of slavery into the western territories, and the constant, gnawing anxiety that the future might belong to people who looked nothing like the colonel and his peers. In Richmond, gentlemen gathered in smoky parlors and candle-lit drawing rooms to argue over the latest theories imported from Europe, pseudo-scientific treatises on race and heredity that promised, with all the certainty of bad philosophy, that society could be improved by controlling bloodlines and breeding out supposed weaknesses. Colonel Hartley amassed these books with the same zeal he once reserved for hunting trophies, stacking them on his desk until their weight seemed to tilt the room. Their contents seeped into his thoughts, feeding his growing sense of dread as he watched his family's fortunes decline, his once proud bloodline threatened by time, his only daughter drifting ever closer to the fate of an old maid. The lessons of war had taught him that when steady patience failed, ruthless action was called for, and that hesitation could be fatal. That July was a crucible, testing the limits of endurance. Day after day, the sun rose like a hammer, flattening the fields and driving men and women to exhaustion. It was during this relentless heat that Colonel Hartley devised a plan he believed would solve all his mounting problems in one daring move. At the far edge of the estate, where the drive curved eastward beneath a tangle of oak and hickory, stood the old overseer's cabin. The structure had been empty since the last overseer died of fever, and for years Hartley had managed the plantation himself, saving $50 each month but letting the building fall to ruin. The cabin was small, its logs rough-hewn and weathered, the roof patched but holding, 2 rooms separated by a breezeway, and a stout stone chimney at one end. Wildlife had claimed it in the meantime, mice in the corners, hornets in the rafters, but its bones were strong, the walls still tight against the rain. In late July, the colonel summoned 3 of his most reliable enslaved men and ordered them to make the cabin habitable again. Under the withering sun, they scrubbed out years of filth, patched the stonework, and aired out the musty rooms. From the main house, he had them carry out spare furniture, a sturdy table, a pair of battered chairs, a narrow bedstead, and a chest for clothes. He directed them to stock the little kitchen with the essentials: flour, cornmeal, salt pork, beans, jars of preserves, and 2 barrels of fresh water laboriously hauled from the deep well near the house. The men worked in silence, aware that the colonel's interest in the cabin portended change, though none could guess its true purpose. Even as they labored, the plantation seemed to hold its breath, the air charged with waiting, as if all their lives were about to be upended by decisions made behind closed doors. A cabin, a bed frame strung with ropes, a mattress stuffed with corn husks, 2 battered chairs, a table, some cooking pots, a few oil lamps, and, oddly enough, a whole pile of books from the colonel's own shelves. The men who hauled all this out kept quiet. They understood something grim was brewing, even if nobody said so out loud. On August 3, 1847, Colonel Hartley called Margaret into his study. Nobody wrote down what they said, not word for word. But the truth leaked out later, in bits and pieces Margaret shared with the only person she'd ever come to trust. The colonel laid out his plan with that icy military logic of his. Margaret would live in the cabin with Joseph for 6 months. She would get pregnant. If the child's skin was pale enough, they'd pass it off as white, orphan it, and send it off to be raised by some distant Hartley relatives. If that didn't work, they'd just do it all again, keep at it, generation after generation until the bloodline was white enough, but still carried the strength the colonel believed enslaved people possessed. It sounds unthinkable now. In 1847, though, there were Southern families who whispered about things like this. Planters treated their slaves like livestock, sometimes picking out who should have children with whom to get the traits they wanted. Some even forced enslaved women to be their mistresses, selling the children or keeping them on as servants. The colonel's plan was colder, more methodical, but it didn't come out of nowhere. Nobody bothered to record what Margaret thought or felt. She didn't fight back. Maybe she was numb. Maybe she'd spent her whole life learning not to argue with her father. Maybe she was already planning what to do next. Either way, on August 5th, she climbed into that wagon without saying a word. Joseph had no choice at all. He sat as far from her as he could, both hands locked so tight on the wagon's rails you could hear the wood creak. The colonel drove them himself. He wouldn't even let an overseer ride along. At the cabin, the colonel spelled out the rules, all business. Joseph got one room, Margaret the other. Every Sunday, someone would leave food and supplies at the door. They weren't allowed to go anywhere. Joseph didn't have to do any other work. Margaret had her books and her sewing. The colonel would come by twice a week to check on them himself. What he didn't tell Margaret was the deal he'd made with Joseph. The night before, he promised Joseph his freedom. If Joseph did what was asked, if Margaret had a healthy child, the colonel would set him free within a year and pay for his passage to Liberia. For Joseph, who'd never once been given a real choice, that promise changed everything. The colonel left them there that hot afternoon. The cabin door shutting with a heavy thud that sounded too much like a coffin closing, Margaret stood in the middle of the room, her trunk at her feet, staring at the stack of books. Novels, poetry, science, all carefully chosen. Joseph hovered by the door, clutching his small bundle, eyes on the floor. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "There are 2 rooms. You should take the one in back." Joseph nodded, slipped away through the breezeway, and shut the connecting door. That first night, Margaret didn't unpack. She sat on the bed, still in her traveling clothes, listening to the forest pressing in, cicadas screaming, owls swooping, something small rustling in the brush. She didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that crying was weakness, and weakness got crushed in a world like hers. Instead, she picked up one of the books her father had left, a novel by Sir Walter Scott, and started to read, and read by lamplight until her eyes burned, letting her mind slip into someone else's story at last. In the back room, Joseph lay on the cornhusk mattress, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. He kept turning freedom over in his mind, trying to imagine what it'd feel like to walk as his own man. He thought about what it would cost him. He thought about the woman in the next room, how she was just as trapped as he was, even if her chains looked different. Days took on a strange rhythm, ordinary, but also not quite real. Margaret always woke before sunrise. She threw together breakfast from what they had: cornbread, fried salt pork, coffee that tasted a bit like burnt chicory. She'd call out through the door, and Joseph would show up, eat without saying much, then slip away again, sometimes back to his room, sometimes outside to chop wood, mend the fence, or dig in the vegetable garden behind the cabin. They fell into an unspoken routine. They ate together but kept quiet. Afternoons they stayed apart. When the heat pressed in during the evenings, they'd both end up on the front porch, hoping for a breeze to cut through the thick air. The Colonel came by every Wednesday and Saturday, always in the late afternoon. He called it an inspection. With Margaret, he put on a concerned face, asked about her health, poked at personal questions, and rattled off advice from whatever pseudoscientific book he was reading that week. With Joseph, the Colonel barely bothered with small talk, just gave orders, reminded him about their deal, and dropped heavy hints about what might happen if Joseph didn't hold up his end. But something was starting to change inside that cabin, something the Colonel never saw coming. He'd spent too long treating people like property to notice when they started acting like people. Margaret and Joseph began to talk. At first it was just the basics: meal times, chores, repairs, the weather. Then slowly cracks opened. Margaret learned Joseph had read many of the books she kept at her bedside. He'd found ways to read them in secret. Joseph realized Margaret's mind was sharp, hungry for real conversation. They dusted off a chess set Margaret found in one of the trunks, and pretty soon she realized Joseph could see several moves ahead. Their talk stayed careful, always aware of the invisible lines drawn by their situation. Still, in those quiet spaces, something delicate began to grow. Not love, not yet, but something like recognition. Each saw a sharp mind locked up by fate, someone who hadn't chosen any of this. By late September, Margaret still wasn't pregnant. The Colonel started to show cracks. His visits turned tense, his questions sharper, his threats less hidden. He dragged in medical books, pointed to passages about fertility, and pressed herbal remedies into Margaret's hands, insisting she take them every day. His desperation seeped through the stiff front he tried to keep. That's when Margaret found the arsenic. The cabin's main room had wallpaper, faded now, but once a bold pattern of dark green leaves on cream. It went up years ago, back when the overseer wanted the place to look fancy. Margaret had noticed it right away, liked the pattern, even though water stains had crept across the top. What she didn't realize at first was that this particular green, Shields green they called it, was loaded with arsenic trioxide. She learned that from a book her father left in the cabin's tiny library, a medical guide that listed common poisons found in ordinary homes. It explained how wallpaper makers used copper arsenite for certain greens, and how damp air could turn that pretty paper deadly. Dust, or how you might scrape it into powder. The book listed the signs of arsenic poisoning: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle cramps, and, if it dragged on, numbness, confusion, and finally death when your organs gave out. The symptoms looked a lot like other illnesses: fever, cholera, so without special chemical tests, which most country doctors never even tried. Nobody noticed the difference. Margaret read that passage 3 times by lamplight on the night of September 23rd. Joseph was outside, fixing a broken shutter. Inside, she ran her finger along the seam where two strips of wallpaper met near the bed. The paste had started crumbling, humidity gnawing at it. Her fingertip came away with a smear of greenish dust. Why did she notice that? What was she thinking in those weeks, when the trees started turning and the Colonel's visits got sharper, more loaded? People would argue about that for years, after the truth came out. But the simplest answer is this. Margaret Hartley was starting to figure out the game. She saw that her father was using both her and Joseph for his own ends. And when he was done, he wouldn't let them just walk away. The Colonel's promise to free Joseph, Margaret realized, was a lie. Virginia law in 1847 made manumission nearly impossible. You needed the legislature's blessing, and they rarely gave it. Even if by some miracle Joseph got his freedom, life for a free black man in Virginia was a constant risk. Slave catchers prowled for runaways and even free men, and nobody stopped them. Joseph knew too much, and the Colonel didn't keep loose ends. He solved problems. He didn't set them free. Margaret saw her own future wasn't much brighter. Even if her father sent the mixed-race child far away, he'd never allow her to return to normal life. The shame and gossip would hang over the family forever, like a storm that never broke. Maybe her father wouldn't kill her, but he could easily have her locked away in an asylum. In those days, women got sent off for far less. Then October rolled in. Margaret started feeling sick in the mornings, tired, appetite gone. She told her father during his Wednesday visit, and he lit up, triumphant. Next time, he brought an old doctor from Richmond. The man asked his questions, poked and prodded, and said yes, it was possible, though it was too early to know for sure. The Colonel was thrilled. Suddenly he was fussing over Margaret, bringing her little treats, telling her to rest, acting almost tender. His manner with Joseph changed too. He was all warmth and vague hints about big changes coming soon. But Margaret wasn't pregnant. She knew that for a fact. She hadn't done what was required. The sickness was arsenic, a little at a time, scraped from the wallpaper and stirred into her evening tea. Just enough to fool her father, to buy time. Time to come up with her own way out. What was that plan? It took shape slowly, over weeks, as she and Joseph started talking honestly for the first time. Joseph told her what the Colonel promised, and that he didn't believe a word of it. Margaret talked about her own fears. They realized they were stuck, both of them, and nobody else was going to save them. So they made a plan together. It was risky, bold, and every step had to be perfect. Margaret kept up the act, padding her dresses and moving in ways that made her look more pregnant by the day. Joseph, meanwhile, started playing his own role, one that took a toll. He complained of headaches, lost his appetite, and looked more and more unwell as the weeks dragged on. By the time Margaret was supposed to give birth, they would need a real baby. The plantation had no shortage of women who were pregnant or had just delivered. If Margaret and Joseph could talk or pressure one of them, they could get a newborn. The plan was for Joseph to die around this time, and Margaret would claim the child as hers. Her father watched all of this unfold, convinced that everything was going according to plan. Once he believed it, Margaret and Joseph, who would only pretend to have died, planned to slip away, heading north along routes they spent months mapping out. It was a risky, complicated scheme, but it wasn't their first time hiding their real selves. They'd both spent their lives pretending, learning exactly what the people in charge wanted to see and hear. Now, they finally had a chance to use those skills for themselves. Arsenic ended up being part of the plan, but not how Margaret first imagined. As autumn turned to winter, she took her performance up a notch. Her belly grew on schedule, thanks to her skill with a needle and the loose dresses women wore at the time. She moved slowly, cradled her stomach, acted more fragile around her father. He absolutely bought it. He started making plans for the future, new land, new equipment, a growing family. He brought her baby clothes from Richmond, a silver rattle, with the family name, even the old cradle he'd used as a baby. Every gift made Margaret's skin crawl. She felt sick with dread about what would happen when he discovered the truth. Joseph's decline became impossible to miss by December. He lost weight, his strength faded, and a deep cough set in. The Colonel brought in the same doctor who'd looked after Margaret. The doctor did all the usual things: listened to Joseph's chest, checked his pulse, handed out whiskey and dubious tonics. Maybe pneumonia, maybe consumption, he said, though Joseph didn't show the bloody cough of tuberculosis. The doctor's main advice: keep Joseph warm and fed. Valuable property should be maintained, he said. What nobody knew, nobody but Joseph, was that his illness was half real, half an act. He made himself sick on purpose. He stood out in the rain, slept with no blanket, ate just enough to stay upright. Most dangerous of all, he started taking small doses of arsenic from the wallpaper Margaret had found. This wasn't part of the original plan. Margaret never wanted him to poison himself. But Joseph saw something she hadn't. A black man couldn't just disappear from a plantation and expect no questions. If Joseph vanished for real, the colonel would hunt for him, using every resource a rich planter could muster. Dogs, slave catchers, the works. Legal bounties, newspaper ads, those were still out there. But if Joseph died in a way that looked real and public, he'd vanish from everyone's calculations. People could bury him, mourn him, move on. Meanwhile, someone with his name and a similar look could slip north with forged papers. For that kind of switch to work, though, they needed a body. And that body had to show the right symptoms, the kind Joseph claimed to have. That's why he started taking arsenic. Enough to make him weak and sick, not enough to kill him on the spot. It was a brutal kind of math. Joseph set out to wreck his own health, betting he'd survive just long enough to fake his death and escape. He hurt himself on purpose so that when someone checked the body, they'd find exactly what they expected: a man wasted away by some fever or consumption, or whatever vague diagnosis country doctors like to use for people who wasted away. Margaret figured it out in early December. She saw the same green powder under his nails that she sometimes found under her own. The truth came out one night after the colonel finished his weekly inspection and left. "You're poisoning yourself," Margaret said, flat and steady. Joseph stared at her for a while, then answered, "I'm making sure we both survive. By dying or looking like I'm dead." He paused. "If I just run, your father will never stop hunting me. But if I'm dead, he stops caring. He'll focus on you, on the child, on his plans. He won't waste time and money chasing someone who's gone." She didn't back down. "You're really getting sick. You could die for real." "I know," Joseph said. "But if I don't do this, I'll die for sure, or stay a slave forever. At least this way I have a shot." Margaret understood his logic, ugly as it was. Joseph was trading away his health, maybe even his life, for a slim shot at freedom. That's what desperation does. It forces you to weigh certain suffering against a tiny hope. "We need a body," Margaret said finally. "If you're going to fake your death, we need something to bury." That was the moment the plan tipped from desperate to truly grim. Over the next few days, they tossed around ideas, each one harder than the last. An empty coffin wouldn't work. The colonel would probably insist on seeing Joseph's body. Plantation rules usually meant the overseer or owner had to confirm a slave's death before burial. They needed a real corpse, someone who might pass for Joseph if no one looked too closely. The answer, when it came, was both straightforward and terrible. There were 2 enslaved men on the plantation, both about Joseph's age and build, Samuel and Isaiah. They worked in the tobacco fields, living far from the main house. Winter brought plenty of death. Pneumonia, flu, accidents, every year some died. Margaret and Joseph weren't plotting murder. They were just waiting for someone to die, ready to make use of it. January 1848 hit hard, icing over the Virginia Piedmont, turning every tree into glass and making the roads nearly impassable. The colonel stopped coming so often. Sometimes 10 days passed between visits, especially when the weather was bad. That distance worked in Margaret and Joseph's favor. The colonel couldn't watch them closely enough to spot mistakes. Margaret was supposed to be 5 months pregnant by then, her dresses padded just right under her winter coat. She'd learned all the tricks: hand on her back, the little waddle, the pauses like she was feeling the baby move. She'd studied every book she could find on the subject. Margaret had pored over the texts her father gave her about pregnancy, memorizing every symptom and tiny change women described. When the colonel quizzed her, she repeated answers straight from his books. It was all rehearsed. Joseph, on the other hand, wasn't faking anything. By late January, his body had wasted away. He'd lost so much weight. His clothes just hung off him. He looked nothing like the strong man he'd been before. The cough never let up. Sometimes he spat up blood. That part terrified Margaret, but Joseph insisted it was all part of the plan. His skin looked gray, his eyes hollowed out. When the colonel stopped by and saw Joseph's condition, he cared only about the money, worried about losing his investment, annoyed by the bad timing. He called the doctor again in late January. This time the doctor took his time. He noticed the weight loss, the harsh breathing, how Joseph couldn't even lift his arms right. He called it advanced consumption, said Joseph probably had weeks left, maybe a month or two at best. The doctor suggested moving Joseph to the plantation's sick house, but the colonel shot that down. Too many questions. Why had Joseph been hiding out in the overseer's cabin for months? That wasn't something the colonel wanted to explain. So he told Margaret to keep Joseph comfortable, feed him, keep him warm, and send word if things got worse. That order changed everything in the cabin. Margaret had grown up believing she should keep her distance from enslaved people, only see them when they were working. Now she was the one tending to Joseph, nursing him through the illness he'd brought on himself. She made broths, brewed teas, changed his sweat-soaked sheets, and sat with him on nights when he struggled for breath. Plantation mistresses sometimes cared for slaves they valued, but always with a kind of cold formality. Margaret couldn't keep that up anymore. Not after everything. They'd plotted together, depended on each other, and now she felt like his pain was partly hers to bear. Whenever Joseph was clear-headed, they talked through the final pieces of their plan. Margaret had managed, through careful hints while her father visited, to reach out to a few women in the quarters. One of them was Ruth, who'd given birth in December to a pale-skinned baby. Word was the baby's father had been the last overseer. Ruth was terrified for her child, caught in a world that didn't accept anyone who didn't fit its harsh categories. Margaret hinted, she never said it outright, that she could give the child a better future. Ruth understood. If Margaret took the baby, the child would be raised as white. Given chances, a mixed-race child would never get on the plantation. Ruth agreed, but she'd carry the weight of that decision for the rest of her life. She'd give up her own child, knowing he'd never know her, always at risk if anyone ever learned the truth. But like so many enslaved mothers, she chose survival, even if it meant heartbreak. The last thing they needed was a body. That's when fate stepped in, brutally. On February 8, 1848, a man named Isaiah collapsed in the tobacco barn. He'd caught influenza, which turned to pneumonia. 2 days later, he was dead. He was 31, about Joseph's size and build. In the end, he'd grown thin and frail, just like Joseph. One of the men who brought supplies to the cabin told Joseph about Isaiah. Within 2 hours, Joseph and Margaret had figured out the final steps of their plan. They'd make the switch at night, 3 days later, when the next delivery came. Joseph would stage a final collapse. Margaret would send an urgent message to her father with the delivery man. While they waited for the colonel to show up, they'd swap the bodies. They couldn't do it alone. They needed the man who brought provisions, a woman from the quarters to get Isaiah's body ready, and Ruth, who would sneak her baby to the cabin under cover of darkness. Each person had their part. Everyone had their own reasons for getting involved. Some wanted to earn favor down the line. Others just didn't want to risk punishment. And a few honestly thought they were helping two desperate people escape from a life no one should have to endure. That night, February 13th, 1848, the temperature dipped below freezing. The moon was full, the sky clear, and the fields of Virginia looked ghostly white, almost like someone had carved the land out of marble. Inside the cabin, Margaret waited, her hands trembling as she got everything ready. She wore her padded dress, trying to steady her nerves. In the back room, Joseph rested on the bed. He was weak but awake, forcing himself to breathe like a dying man. At 9, wheels crunched on the frozen dirt. Silas, the provision man, showed up with his cart. It wasn't just food he carried. Hidden in the back was a pine coffin with Isaiah's body inside. Ruth followed, slipping through the shadows with her baby bundled to her chest. The boy was 3 months old and slept soundly, unaware of everything. They moved fast. They had to. Isaiah's body was carried into the cabin and dressed in Joseph's clothes, laid carefully on Joseph's bed. Joseph pulled on a dark coat and hat, slipped out the back door, and climbed into a secret compartment Silas had built in the cart. Ruth handed her baby to Margaret. Margaret's hands shook so badly she almost dropped him. The baby woke up and cried, and Margaret pressed him close, shushing him, feeling his tiny heart pounding against her. She looked at Ruth in the moonlight. Tears streaked Ruth's face, but her eyes were so full of sorrow, Margaret almost couldn't bear it. It was like she carried the grief of generations. "I'll keep him safe," Margaret whispered. "I promise." Ruth nodded once, then disappeared into the darkness. She didn't say a word because if she spoke, she might break. Silas drove the cart away, Joseph hidden under sacks of grain and supplies. The plan was to get him to a contact in Richmond, a free black man who worked the docks and knew people in the Underground Railroad. From there, Joseph would head north using papers that said he was Daniel Collins, a freedman and a carpenter looking for work in Pennsylvania. Margaret went back inside, cradling the baby, and stared at Isaiah's body in Joseph's bed. Tomorrow she'd find him dead. The colonel would come, see what he expected, a slave dead from consumption, just as everyone predicted. He'd order a burial, probably grumble about losing property, but he wouldn't suspect a thing. The death would go in the plantation register. Joseph would vanish from Virginia's records as if he'd never lived. But Margaret messed up. She misjudged her father. She thought the colonel would accept Joseph's death as just another loss. She never guessed he'd want a full investigation, not after pouring so much of himself into his so-called eugenic scheme. She didn't think about how he'd react when he started doubting her pregnancy. At dawn, Margaret sent the signal for Joseph's death, just as they'd planned, by hanging a black cloth in the window. 3 hours later, Colonel Hartley showed up, furious, with the county physician in tow. Margaret had never seen him like this. The colonel checked Isaiah's body from head to toe. He looked at the hands, the face, the build. He grilled Margaret about Joseph's final hours, his illness, anything unusual he might have said before dying. The physician did his exam and declared it was consumption, but the colonel didn't seem convinced. Then out of nowhere he turned to Margaret and asked, "Where did you bury the placenta?" His eyes were locked on Margaret's padded stomach. Her mind went blank. With all she'd read about pregnancy, all her planning, she hadn't seen that question coming. "I don't understand, Father. When women miscarry in the 5th month, there's tissue that must be disposed of," he said, his voice cold as ice. It was too early for a fully formed child, but there should have been something. So where was it? "I haven't miscarried," Margaret insisted, panic creeping into her voice. "The baby is fine." The colonel shot out his hand and grabbed her belly, squeezing hard enough to feel the padding beneath her dress. His face twisted from suspicion into pure rage. Without warning, he tore open her dress, exposing the layers of cloth and padding she'd used to fake her pregnancy. "You lying?" he hissed, breath hot and shaking. "There is no child." Everything after that happened fast and ugly. The colonel slapped Margaret hard enough to send her sprawling on the floor. He stormed around, overturning chairs, screaming questions she couldn't answer with her mouth full of blood and broken teeth. He yanked her up by the hair and dragged her to Isaiah's body, demanding to know where Joseph was, what she'd done, who had helped her. Margaret, terrified and battered, clung to her last lie. She told her father Joseph was dead, that this body was his. She said she'd lied about the pregnancy to hide the shame of what he'd forced her to do. No one else was involved. Joseph died never knowing the truth. The physician, looking deeply uncomfortable with the violence playing out, tried to step in. The colonel barked at him to examine the body to prove it was actually Joseph. The poor doctor, without any real way to identify the corpse, could only say the body matched Joseph's build, age, and the way illness had wasted him. The colonel wasn't happy, but he had no proof to argue against Margaret's story, so he made up his mind, cold and sharp. Joseph would be buried right away, no ceremony, no marker. Margaret would be locked in her room. No one would mention the false pregnancy again. He'd strike the whole mess from the family record as if it had never happened, but the colonel was falling apart inside. He'd poured 6 months' money and his last hope into this desperate scheme. Now it was over. Not just a personal defeat, but the death of the Hartley line. His legacy was finished. That night, alone in his study, he drank and pored over his medical books about pregnancy and inheritance, the ones that had sparked this whole plan. He convinced himself Margaret had poisoned Joseph, that she'd murdered his property, destroyed his future. The days that followed got stranger. The colonel stalked the plantation, grilling the enslaved people for answers, searching for co-conspirators. He tore through the cabin for clues, checked death records across the county, hunting for any sign that someone had swapped the bodies. He started seeing connections everywhere: the timing of Isaiah's death, delivery schedules, certain trusted slaves near the cabin that night. But the whole story stayed just out of reach, and that drove him wild. He accused Margaret of witchcraft, claimed she'd cursed the family with some dark ritual. He even thought about sending her to the asylum in Williamsburg. He wrote letters to relatives, floating the idea of Margaret living out her days as a disgraced spinster under their care. Margaret, locked in her room, drifted through those days numb with fear and exhaustion. The colonel let no one visit, banned letters, barely gave her enough food. He told the staff she was suffering from grief and needed isolation. The servants, who'd known Margaret since she was a child, snuck in what little comforts they could. But they couldn't set her free. On March 3, 1848, someone found Colonel Edmund Hartley dead in his study. He'd collapsed over his desk, foam at his mouth, body twisted by convulsions. The same physician who'd seen Margaret and Joseph came to examine him and called it apoplexy, a stroke, common enough in stressed, hard-drinking men of his age. Still, the doctor noticed something odd in his. These were private records, buried away for decades before anyone found them. The colonel's symptoms looked a lot more like strychnine poisoning than a natural stroke, but nobody could find any poison. No source, nothing. And honestly, just hinting that a respected veteran and wealthy planter had been murdered by his own daughter, that was too much. Without rock-solid proof, no one wanted to go there. The doctor just wrote natural causes and kept quiet. That was it. When they found the colonel's body, the staff finally let Margaret out of her locked room. She said she didn't know a thing about his death. She'd been locked up and alone for days. But then they read the colonel's will. He'd left everything to Margaret. Suddenly, she owned 400 acres, the house, and 17 enslaved people, including Ruth and her baby boy. Settling Colonel Hartley's estate dragged on for 6 months. Turns out, he'd hidden more debt than anyone guessed. Not even Margaret saw it coming. She found out fast the plantation was mortgaged to the hilt. Creditors seemed to hold a claim on almost everything. Her father's last days had been a mess of paranoia. He'd even pulled out large sums of cash that vanished without a trace. Margaret didn't have much choice. She had to sell off acres, some of the enslaved people, most of the furniture, just to cover the debts and keep the place running, even at the bare minimum. Selling human beings, people she'd grown up with, people who'd risked everything for her, it shattered whatever she had left of her own moral certainty. She tried to tell herself she was careful. She picked local buyers she thought might be less cruel. She tried to keep families together when she could. But deep down, she knew these were just excuses. She was part of the same system she'd always hated. Every sale felt like breaking a promise she'd made to herself, back when she still believed she could be different than her father. But Ruth? Margaret couldn't sell Ruth. Ruth's eyes followed little Edmund everywhere, and it tore at Margaret every time she saw it. Ruth had lost everything, and all she got for it was the distant chance to watch her own son, now being raised by another woman. Margaret put Ruth to work in the main house, officially as Edmund's nursemaid, so she could at least be near him. It was a small mercy, but it hurt both of them. They never talked about it. Ruth just held Edmund when he cried, sang him her childhood songs, taught him to skip stones and find birds and pick the sweetest blackberries behind the tobacco barn. Margaret watched these moments with a mess of feelings: gratitude, guilt, a fierce possessiveness she couldn't shake. Through it all, she kept Ruth's baby, the child she'd promised to protect. To the county clerk, she claimed the child was the orphaned son of a dead cousin from North Carolina, adopted during her hysterics after her father's death. The story didn't hold up to much scrutiny, but Margaret was a white woman with property, and people just believed her. They never would have given the benefit of the doubt to someone like Ruth. She named the boy Edmund, after her father. Maybe it was some kind of cruel joke, or maybe she was just trying to anchor the boy to the Hartley family, to make him belong, at least on paper. Who knows? Maybe she thought it would sting her father's memory, giving his name to a child he never would have accepted. A child who proved all his twisted ideas about blood and lineage wrong. Or maybe she needed the name to keep up the lie, to make herself believe the boy was really part of her family. Edmund grew up in the big house, raised as white. Margaret scraped together what money she could to hire tutors, even when she couldn't really afford it. She brought in teachers from Richmond and made sure he learned Latin, math, literature, history, all the things a Hartley was supposed to know. Margaret was determined that Edmund would get every chance, every privilege her father once dreamed of for a son. The irony never escaped her. Edmund, the supposed Hartley heir, carried none of the Colonel's blood. Instead, he had the blood of people the Colonel once enslaved. That twist kept Margaret up at night. Sometimes she almost believed the universe played favorites, that there was a hidden sense of justice working itself out. The town accepted Edmund as a Hartley, more or less. Still, some neighbors whispered about his darker skin, or about Margaret herself and why she'd never married. People speculated about her past. Maybe she had a secret lover, maybe the child was really a cousin's, maybe something worse. But in a place where reputation mattered much more than truth, rumors never really stuck without proof. Margaret owned a plantation, even if it wasn't what it used to be, and that still meant something. As Edmund grew up, Margaret watched him with a sharp, almost desperate focus. She searched his face for traces of Joseph, for any hint of family. But Edmund's features were mostly Ruth's, her delicate bones, her quick, clever eyes. His coloring suggested someone further back, a grandfather or great-grandfather Margaret would never know. He didn't look like any one person, but somehow he could blend in. In a society obsessed with categories, it was amazing how easily people accepted what they wanted to see. Margaret stayed single. No one thought it odd. She was past her prime, with a child whose origins were always in question, and a plantation sinking into debt. Men who might have proposed stayed away. Margaret had a reputation for being sharp, efficient, and not exactly warm. She threw herself into running the place, surprising everyone who remembered her as the soft, bookish girl she used to be. She learned farming by necessity, reading everything she could, picking up skills the way she'd once devoured novels. She tried new crops, spent what little money she had on better tools, and somehow kept the operation afloat. She managed the people she still enslaved, not out of cruelty, but out of tired practicality. Margaret knew what it meant to be stuck in a bad system with no good way out. She treated the enslaved people on her land with a little more humanity than most. Better food, fewer punishments, small mercies here and there. It wasn't kindness, really, just something less brutal than the usual. Still, she bought and sold people when she had to. She enforced rules. She played her part in the machinery of slavery, even though she understood better than most how rotten it all was. That contradiction wore her down, leaving her efficient but hollow. She kept the plantation going, barely, as the years dragged on. By the time the Civil War hit Virginia in 1863, Edmund was 15, tall, serious, already dreaming of college if the war ever ended. Ruth, still working in the house, was 41, her hair streaked with gray, her body showing every year of hard labor. Margaret herself was 48, looking even older, her hair now completely white. She was finally thin, just as her father had wanted. But it was the result of stress and hunger, not any discipline or diet. As Union and Confederate armies marched all around, Margaret made the decision that would define her last years. She freed everyone still enslaved on her land, including Ruth, who had always stayed close to her son, even though he was raised as someone else's child. It wasn't all about doing the right thing. The Emancipation Proclamation had already declared them free, and Union troops were getting closer every day. Margaret was just facing reality, but she did it properly. She drew up papers, explained what they meant, made sure everyone understood. Now they were free to leave, or to stay and work for wages if that's what they wanted. Most people didn't hang around. Within days, they were gone, heading for Union lines or searching for family members from other plantations, people they'd been torn from years before. Ruth left too. Margaret knew Ruth would go, but the pain of it still hit her in ways she hadn't expected. The night before Ruth left, she appeared in the doorway of Margaret's study. Her face was impossible to read. They just stood there for a moment, not saying anything. Then Ruth broke the silence. "Take care of my son. I always have," Margaret started to say, but Ruth cut her off. Her voice was steely this time. "Take care of my son. Tell him the truth when he's old enough. Tell him his mama loved him so much she gave him away. Tell him." She stopped. Words failed her. Margaret stood up, crossed the room, then hesitated. She didn't know if Ruth wanted comfort or just space. "I'll tell him," Margaret said at last. "When he's ready, I'll tell him everything." Ruth nodded just once, turned, and walked away. She left Virginia in 1863 and joined the contraband camps that followed the Union Army. She never told anyone that Edmund was her son. She kept that secret until she died in Philadelphia in 1879. By then she'd married, settled down, and raised 3 children who grew up free. Those kids knew they had an older half-brother out there somewhere, but Ruth never gave them his name or clues about him. All she ever said was that he was living as white, and if anyone revealed his identity, it would ruin him. Her children respected her wishes. They never went looking. Edmund Hartley lived until 1891. He died at 43 from heart failure, never knowing who his mother really was. Margaret had promised Ruth she'd tell him the truth, but when the time came, she couldn't face it. Instead, she wrote a letter explaining everything and left instructions for it to be given to Edmund after she died. But when Margaret passed in 1867, the person in charge of her tiny estate, a distant cousin, read the letter, was horrified, and burned it right away to protect the family's reputation. So Edmund went to his grave believing he was just the adopted orphan of Margaret's late cousin. He never learned the real reason he'd been given up, or about Joseph's sacrifice, or the desperate plan that had shaped his whole life. He married, had 2 kids, and worked as an accountant in Richmond. He lived a solid middle-class life in the South after the war. His children and grandchildren carried on the Hartley name, never knowing the truth about where they came from. One of Edmund's granddaughters became a teacher in the 1920s, quietly passing as white in a world that demanded it, carrying on a deception that started with her great-grandmother's desperate choice. Another moved to California in the 1930s and worked as a set designer in Hollywood. The family's whole story faded away. The old Virginia plantation was just a hazy tale about ancestors who'd owned land once, nothing more. Margaret died in 1867 of pneumonia, in the same room where her father died 19 years before. She was only 52, but looked much older, worn out by years of impossible choices and guilt she could never shake. She left behind almost nothing. No diaries, hardly any letters, no memoir. Maybe she never kept records. Maybe she destroyed them before she died. Nobody knows. The plantation got sold to pay off her debts, and the house eventually crumbled into ruin. By 1904 it was gone, knocked down by time and weather. In her last days, as pneumonia made every breath a struggle, Margaret was cared for by Sarah, an elderly freedwoman who'd once worked in the Hartley kitchen. Later, Sarah told her grandchildren that Margaret's last words, whispered so softly Sarah had to lean in to catch them, were, "Tell Joseph I kept my promise." Sarah didn't know who Joseph was, or what promise Margaret meant. By the time anyone cared enough to dig into the Hartley story, Sarah had been dead 40 years, and her grandchildren only half remembered the tale, the truth about what happened in the overseer's cabin back in 1847 and 1848 would have stayed buried forever, except for what happened in 1912. During renovations at an old warehouse in Richmond, someone found a tin box of letters and donated it to the Virginia Historical Society in 1913. For a while, those letters sparked a little burst of academic interest, then slipped into obscurity as historians focused more on the bigger stories of slavery and the Civil War. In 1924, a professor named Dr. Harold Stevenson from the College of William and Mary put out a limited scholarly edition of the letters. He saw their value as first-hand accounts of the Underground Railroad and the tangled relationships at the heart of slavery. But he didn't dig much deeper. He didn't make the connection to the Hartley family, and he didn't even try to chase down the larger story behind the letters. Stevenson treated the letters mostly as examples of language. He zeroed in on the writing styles, the secret codes for escape, and the way they mapped out the Underground Railroad network in Virginia. His edition came loaded with footnotes about word choice and grammar, but he barely tried to figure out who DC was or where the letters came from. In his introduction, he basically shrugged, guessing the letter writers were probably long dead, and their names lost for good, that lack of curiosity, or maybe he just didn't want to stir up trouble, kept the Hartley connection buried for another 23 years. The letters waited in the archives of the Historical Society, sometimes pulled out by researchers studying the Underground Railroad or antebellum Virginia, but never drawing much attention. They were filed away under some bland label. Anonymous correspondence 1848-1849 related to fugitive slaves, with no hint of the real story inside. So there they sat, gathering dust while the truth waited for someone stubborn enough to dig. That someone finally came along in 1947. Elizabeth Winters, a graduate student, was working her way through county death records for her dissertation on sudden deaths among Virginia planters in the 1840s. She wanted to know if there was a pattern, violence, or poisoning that doctors covered up to protect white families from scandal. Winters stumbled onto Colonel Hartley's death almost by accident. She was flipping through old death certificates from Frederick County when she noticed something odd. Colonel Edmund Hartley's certificate, signed by a Dr. Nathaniel Vaughn, had a strange mark in the margin, an asterisk circled in ink. She checked other certificates signed by Vaughn from 1846 to 1851. 3 more showed the same mark, all for wealthy white men who'd died suddenly of strokes or heart failure. That caught her attention. Digging further, Winters discovered Dr. Vaughn had kept a private journal, never published, where he used that symbol to flag cases where he suspected foul play but couldn't prove it, or felt it was safer to let things lie. She found the journal with Vaughn's great-grandson in Norfolk. Inside, a brief entry described Colonel Hartley's death. All the classic signs of strychnine, convulsions, foam, but no source, no witnesses, and the man's daughter locked in her room. Vaughn wrote, "What am I to do? Accuse a grieving daughter with no evidence? Destroy her reputation and invite a lawsuit? I mark this case with my private symbol and leave it to God's judgment." If she did poison him, she had provocations I cannot imagine bearing myself. That one passage set Winters off. She started digging into the Hartley family, hunting down property records, bills of sale, plantation ledgers, and court files. She uncovered the odd circumstances of Edmund's adoption. The 6 months when Margaret and Joseph were isolated in the overseer's cabin, Joseph's death from consumption just weeks before Colonel Hartley died. She even found testimony in county records from people who'd been enslaved at the Hartley plantation in 1848. After the Civil War, some mentioned in their freedom papers that they'd witnessed strange goings-on at the plantation that year. Winters spent the next 3 years tracking records, interviewing elderly descendants of those enslaved on the Hartley plantation, and reading the letters all over again, this time with fresh eyes and new questions. She chased down every scrap of evidence she could find. Winters traveled all over Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, knocking on doors, hoping someone remembered the Hartley family, or a man named Daniel Collins, a carpenter who'd worked in Pittsburgh from the late 1840s through the 1870s. In Pittsburgh, she finally found something. Records showing Daniel Collins bought property in the Hill District back in 1852. That neighborhood was a haven for free black families, a place where people built lives out of freedom and hard work. Collins married in 1854. His wife, Abigail Freeman, had escaped slavery in Maryland. Together they had 3 children between 1855 and 1861. Collins kept busy. He worked as a carpenter, got involved with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and served on the board of a school for black children. He didn't get rich, but he built a solid, comfortable life. The last time Winters saw his name was on a property tax record from 1873. After that, he vanished from Pittsburgh's records. Maybe he died, maybe he moved, or maybe he just slipped through the cracks. Winters tried chasing down his children, but after 1880, the trail fizzled out. The census that year listed Abigail as a widow, living with her grown daughter and a few grandchildren. After that, nothing. If Joseph had really survived and lived as Daniel Collins until the 1870s, his descendants either scattered or their stories got lost. Still, the idea that Joseph, if he was Daniel Collins, managed to carve out 25 years of freedom, build a family, and find some normalcy after everything he'd endured, gave Winters a tiny bit of hope. It wasn't proof, just the faintest glimmer. Winters spent hours interviewing elderly African Americans whose families had lived through the Hartley years. Some stories lit up the past. Some just hurt. In 1949, she met Clara Ara Jefferson, 84 years old. Clara Ara's grandmother had been enslaved on the Hartley plantation. She remembered old stories, a colonel's daughter who lost her mind, a strong man who got sick and died, except some folks insisted he didn't die at all. Clara Ara's grandmother always said Ruth, Edmund's real mother was treated differently by Margaret after the colonel died. She was still enslaved, but Margaret never hit her, never shouted, even though Margaret could be harsh with others. Ruth spent more time with the white child than made sense for a field hand's daughter. Something was off. Another story came from Thomas Crawford, a 92-year-old in Philadelphia. He knew Ruth in the 1870s. They went to the same church. He remembered her as a sad woman who rarely talked about her past, except to say she'd left a piece of her heart in Virginia. Once, Ruth told Thomas's mother that she'd given up a child so he could live free. She said it was the right thing, and the worst thing she'd ever done. Thomas's mother passed that story down to him, and he handed it to Winters. Without realizing it was the key Winters needed to finally understand who Edmund really was. Winters kept digging, combing through pension records from the Reconstruction era. She found an application from 1881. A woman named Ruth Williams, who fit Ruth's description, had filed for a widow's pension. She said her husband fought in the United States Colored Troops during the Civil War. The application listed her as formerly from Virginia, with 4 children, 3 living, 1 raised elsewhere during slavery because she'd had no choice. The government denied her claim, saying she hadn't proved the marriage. But just seeing that application proved Ruth survived the war, got married, and, at least on paper, admitted she'd lost a child to slavery. When Winters finished her dissertation in 1950, she pulled together as much of the story as the fragments allowed. She argued that Margaret and Joseph worked together to pull off an elaborate deception, maybe the only way out of an impossible situation involving a faked pregnancy and death, a plan that, oddly enough, half worked and half blew up in their faces. Winters also insisted that Margaret probably poisoned her father, though she admitted nobody would ever be able to prove it for certain. The dissertation sprawled across 473 pages, packed with footnotes, appendices, and all kinds of evidence, transcriptions from the letters in the tin box, pages from Dr. Vaughn's journal, property deeds, death records, and more. Winters didn't cut corners. She tracked down every thread, checked every fact, and built what she saw as an airtight argument for her version of events. Her committee at the University of Virginia loved it, calling it groundbreaking and holding it up as a model for historical investigation. But once the work got out into the wider world, it stirred up a mess of mixed feelings. The response exposed a lot of nerves about the way people wanted American history told, especially when the story made the antebellum South look more complicated than some folks liked. Some historians thought Winters was seeing plots where there weren't any, reading too much into the evidence. A Duke professor, for example, wrote in the American Historical Review in 1951 that Winters had let her imagination run amok, spinning a dramatic story from documents that could mean lots of things. He argued that Colonel Hartley almost certainly died of natural causes, a stroke from stress and drinking, and that blaming Margaret for poisoning him was pure speculation. He even questioned whether the letters from the tin box were written by Margaret and Joseph at all. Maybe they were from totally unrelated people whose lives never touched the Hartley plantation. That review stung, and it set the tone for how a lot of male historians treated Winters' work through the 1950s. They accused her of being too emotionally invested, too close to her subjects, not objective enough for real scholarship. Those criticisms, pretty common for women in academia back then, pushed her dissertation to the margins. Even though her research was more careful and thorough than most of her detractors, some critics said she went too easy on Margaret, as if she were excusing murder because it was self-defense against a controlling father. A female professor from Louisiana, reviewing the dissertation in the Journal of Southern History in 1952, hit Winters for romanticizing a woman who owned slaves up until the war forced her hand, and for glossing over Margaret's part in upholding a racist system. According to this reviewer, Margaret didn't deserve understanding. She deserved blame. Winters's attempt to show Margaret as both victim and oppressor, she wrote, was morally sloppy and bad history. Meanwhile, others argued about Joseph's ending. Did he really escape or die trying? A leading Underground Railroad scholar weighed in a year later, claiming that Daniel Collins living in Pittsburgh couldn't be Joseph. The dates didn't match, and besides, someone who'd poisoned himself with arsenic wouldn't have survived the trip north, much less built a new life. He figured Joseph probably died soon after fleeing, maybe in Richmond or somewhere else along the way, and that Daniel Collins was just another freedman, unrelated to the Hartleys. Winters didn't take all this lying down. She fired back in academic journals throughout the 1950s and early 60s, holding her ground. She pointed out that arsenic can be deadly, sure, but in small doses spread out over time, people sometimes recover, especially with proper care and luck. Nutrition. She pointed out that there was plenty of time between Joseph's disappearance in February 1848 and Daniel Collins showing up in Pittsburgh property records in 1852, enough to recover, travel, and start over under a new name. She insisted the letters were too detailed, too precise. They mentioned the cabin, Ruth, Edmund, and a string of events that lined up perfectly with plantation records. There was no real way they came from anyone but Margaret and Joseph. Still, it didn't matter. The damage was done. Publishers kept turning her down in the 1950s. They said her book wouldn't sell, or they worried about accusations of libel, even though everyone involved was long dead. University presses got nervous about a white woman accusing another white woman of murder, and about the idea of enslaved people acting as cunning conspirators instead of passive victims. Winter's story just pushed too hard against the stories people wanted to believe about the Old South. It suggested Southern daughters could be both victims and villains. It showed enslaved people outsmarting their masters with elaborate ruses. It hinted that family trees labeled pure white might actually have hidden black roots. It cracked open those tidy boxes of race and class that the whole Southern system depended on, boxes people desperately wanted to keep sealed. Winters finally managed to get a stripped-down version published as a journal article in 1956, but hardly anyone read it except a few experts. She never landed a tenure-track job, no matter how sharp her research or how hard she worked. She spent the 50s and 60s teaching at women's colleges across the South, always as a temp, always half expecting the next pink slip. She died in 1969, just 56, from cancer. Her dissertation never made it to print. Her life's work on the Hartley plantation sat unread in a filing cabinet in her small Raleigh apartment. When she died, the local paper called her a dedicated teacher and respected neighbor, but didn't say one word about her groundbreaking research. But some things don't leave room for debate, even if academics argue forever. What Winters uncovered was just plain horrifying. A father treating his own daughter and an enslaved man like breeding stock, forcing them into something neither wanted. A woman so traumatized she turned calculating, maybe even deadly. A man who chose poison over slavery. A mother who gave up her child, hoping he might have a shot at a better life as someone else's son. And a boy who grew up never knowing who he really was, passing as white in a world that would have destroyed him if it found out. Slavery's legacy didn't stop with the chains. It forced regular people, who in another time might have led ordinary lives, into decisions that wrecked them inside and out. Margaret Hartley started as a victim and became a victimizer. Joseph sacrificed his health and his whole identity for a shot at freedom. Ruth let her son go, choosing his survival over her own ties to him. The Colonel shattered everything he claimed to love, all for the sake of legacy and racial purity. No one got out unharmed. Every choice cost more than anyone wanted to pay. Margaret spent the rest of her life trapped by guilt and secrets she couldn't tell. If Joseph survived, he lived as someone else, cut off from everyone who'd known him before. Ruth spent years knowing her son lived, but never able to reach him. Edmund lived and died without ever learning the truth, never knowing how much people had given up so he could walk free, in a world built on the backs of people who looked like his mother. The Hartley plantation is gone now. The forest took it back. The overseer's cabin, where it all happened, fell in the 1890s, leaving just a hollow in the earth and some old chimney stones. The main house came down in 1904, and the land got split up and sold to buyers who had no clue about its past. There's nothing left to see except a historical marker by the highway put up in 1936. It just lists the plantation's dates and its name, nothing more. The marker says nothing about Margaret, Joseph, Ruth, or Edmund. Their story just faded into the background, quietly circling among the few scholars who stumbled across Winters's old 1956 article, or found those anonymous letters buried in the Virginia Historical Society's archives. The truth stuck around, but only in pieces, in those letters tucked away in a tin box, in the county death records where odd notes fill the margins, in stories handed down by families who once lived as slaves on that land, and in Elizabeth Winter's dissertation, still unpublished, just sitting in some archive, collecting dust, The story survived because it refused to let go of the ugly parts of American history, the parts where slavery twisted every relationship, where desperation pushed people so far they barely recognized themselves, where the victims of one system sometimes became the perpetrators of another. And then there's that question, what really happened in that cabin during those 6 months, shut off from everything? Was Margaret just a desperate daughter doing what she had to do to survive her father's cruelty? Or was she more calculating, using Joseph's need for escape for her own advantage? Did Joseph really slip away and spend 25 years in Pittsburgh as Daniel Collins, free at last, raising kids and building a new life? Or did he die somewhere along the way? Just another person lost to a world that treated people like things to be owned and thrown away. And Edmund? What if he'd known the truth about where he came from? About his mother's sacrifice, about the secret that made his very existence possible? There aren't any easy answers. These lives weren't simple. Every choice came with a cost. The world they lived in, built on power and oppression, didn't offer real options, just different ways to suffer, different things to lose. It's not fair to paint Margaret as purely evil and ignore how she was crushed by slavery and patriarchy herself. But turning her into a tragic heroine wipes out the fact that she was part of a system that enslaved people. Joseph wasn't just a victim. He was smart and made a plan to escape. Calling him a hero, though, erases the brutal price he paid, both in his body and his life. And Ruth? Her choice only makes sense if you remember the love she felt for her child and the monstrous system that made such a choice even possible. The Hartley plantation story wrecks any tidy, comforting story about good guys and bad guys or obvious right and wrong. It's about people trapped in a nightmare, forced to make choices that would break anyone, just trying to survive, sometimes through lies or sacrifice or violence. It's a reminder that history isn't made up of saints and monsters, but real people, shaped by forces so much bigger than themselves, sometimes just scraping by, sometimes trying to do something a little better, even if it costs them nearly everything. If this story disturbed you or made you think, let me know what's on your mind. Do you believe Margaret poisoned her father? Did Joseph really make it out and live as Daniel Collins? What would you have done if you were Ruth? Would you have given up your own child for even a slim hope at a better life? These questions aren't comfortable, but they matter if we want to look at American history honestly instead of hiding behind nice stories. Stick around for more deep dives into the parts of history most people would rather ignore, the stories that challenge us, unsettle us, and force us to face truths we'd rather not see. Share this with someone who can handle a story without easy answers, who wants to see the real moral messiness that comes with survival under oppression. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. And remember, the scariest stories are the ones that actually happened. The most important histories are the ones people tried hardest to bury. The past isn't gone. It's still here, in our institutions, in the stories we tell ourselves, in the things we never think to question. And sometimes, if you dig deep enough, you realize the story you thought you knew was never the whole story at all.